Okay. Hello, everyone who's watching us online, and we continue the series of online talks and lectures within Repractice, Reengage with Nature Laboratory, which is devoted to the ecological issues of Kazakhstan and Central Asia, and imagining and reimagining our relations with nature via digital tools and digital media. So today we have a talk. Today we'll talk about the speculative method for liberating suppressed history. And our speaker today is Russell Hlongwane, a cultural producer who is based in Durban, South Africa. His work obsesses over the tensions in heritage, modernity, culture, and tradition as they apply to Black life. His practice includes artistic research, cultural production, design theory, writing, film, urban studies, and curatorship. Russell, nice to see you. Hello. And congratulations on getting the Stars Prize Africa Award, Distinction Award for Dzata. That was very great news. And yeah, congratulations on that. So I'll give the floor to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Aliyah, and thank you to the team at Celini, Sense of a Contemporary Culture. Yes, it's really it's a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with you this morning. Thanks for making the time. Yeah, I mean, I have to start with the kind of disclaimer that Kazakhstan first came onto my map through someone who's actually on this call. Her name is Anel. And ever since, it's been I've been very curious, and hello, Anel. Since then, I've been very curious and interested in Kazakhstan. So I'm really grateful that we've got this moment to kind of to be to be in conversation. So I'm based in Durban, which is on the eastern coast of South Africa, kind of towards the bottom of the continent. We are facing the Indian Ocean. So what I look to do over the next moment together is to kind of map out an approach, a kind of speculative approach towards working with underexposed, with suppressed histories or kind of counter histories alongside kind of quote unquote world history, and kind of using my own background as well as a bunch of projects as a way to demonstrate and kind of make a case for that approach. I think the question that one is working towards is, what does this approach, what do these methods do for the context of Kazakhstan? In my view, there's an obsession over the past years, maybe 10 years or so, around the notion of Afrofuturism. And while that is valid, I often think that it sometimes consumes too much space. I think in my view, it needs to utilize the attention of the arts world to distribute that attention and see if one can start to map out a broader geography of futurisms from the South, of futurisms of many centers as opposed to Africa, you know. And of course, there's some dangers that are contained in there, which I won't get into. But I kind of just wanted to put that as a maybe not so much a caveat, but as a question that I'm interested in the context of this conversation. You know, it's kind of situating my own practice and trying to find out what does it mean for you, and kind of how can we start to create a plurality of futurisms as opposed to one, you know, kind of African futurism. To also mention that there's been this kind of it's not so much a contestation, but a questioning from practitioners on the continents, a questioning of Afrofuturism as a kind of, you know, a catch-all phrase a range of works that are located in the diaspora as well as the continents. And some have argued for an African futurism. You know, it's kind of thinking of an Afrofuturism as well as African futurism. African futurisms often referring to practices emerging from practitioners that are based on the continents. Some would say that they kind of speak more directly to the conditions, to the material, the political and economic conditions of the African continent, whereas Afrofuturisms kind of faces, or at least is located in the north and kind of faces south. And there's so you know, it's not to discredit the one, but I thought it's useful to distinguish this nuance between Afrofuturism and African futurisms. For me, the labels are not the point really. I think it's what the work does, and it's what the work points to that I think is the more important question here. So with that, I will get into my presentation. I had asked for the kind of the students to have a look at 3 films as well as an article. I don't know, Aliyah, do you think I can ask whether or at least ask if how many people have not seen the films, just so that it's not. Yeah, okay. It's not to put anyone on the spot, but rather it's a way for me to establish how much detail I might need to get into it for those who have not watched the films. So if I can maybe just have a raise of hands of those who did not watch the films as well as the article. Okay, all right. So majority watched it. Okay, thank you for that. All right, okay, sure. Good. All right. So I'll share now. Um, so let me see if I can make this full screen. You. Okay. I know this is not working. Yeah, I often struggle to get this on full screen. Okay, this is the best I can do, so I apologize. Everyone can see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm kind of looking here. I'm kind of starting out as a way to situate my practice. One can start with the notion that history is an incomplete document. What we learn as world history, at least in the context of South Africa, is primarily North America and Europe. This accounts for world history, and perhaps what I'm interested in at this point are histories that are hyperlocalized. And so kind of speaking from my context, speaking to the world, so to say. And as a way of doing this, one starts to accumulate a plurality of histories, so multiple histories emerging from multiple centers, so to speak. And so part of the work that we're engaged in is not completing the document that is history, but it's contributing towards it. History is also insecure. It's not stable. And there's something about that instability, there's something about that insecurity that is history that I think is quite evocative and quite inviting. Um, and and perhaps the points, the fault lines is, I think, for me, the greatest interest. It's the stuff that is not spoken about, it's the stuff that is not written, it is the stuff that is often contested that I think we are particularly drawn to. And we try to unpack this. And this method of unpacking, this method of kind of accounting for multiple versions and ways of authenticating theory is the speculative method. And why the speculative method? Primarily because the histories, I mean, coming from the context of South Africa, where localized histories have very scant records, which is to say there's not a great amount of material that is written down by us. A lot of the material that is written down was written by settlers, for example, and kind of it's crafted historical imagination in a very particular way, you know? And so the speculative method often requires us to play in a very liberated, it's to be very playful, it's to be provocative and audacious in the claims that we put forward as artists, not as historians. And often case, the histories that we engage with are often dismissed, they're undermined, and they're always questioned by the authority figures. When I say the authority figures, I'm talking here academia, and I'm talking here the writers of history with the capital H. And so as an artist, I don't have to conform to the conventions and the requirements that are otherwise placed on a historian. So the speculative is really a kind of a playful way, it's an artistic way, but at the same time, a very critical and an intellectually rigorous method of working with this insecure history. And so one kind of looks at two places of accumulating and drawing history. The one is in the classroom, where one learns about world history, the history of North America and Europe, primarily to some degree, kind of the Soviet Union and so on, you know. But basically, the classroom is where one kind of gets schooled to understand a particular kind of world making and nationalism. Okay. The other place of accumulating and drawing up history is the field. And when I say the field, I'm talking about society, I'm talking about community, I'm talking about encounters with people from below, you know. And I mean, to maybe kind of talk very, very briefly about the political history of South Africa. It's only 1994 that this country have its first democratic election. So before this was apartheid, and before that was settler colonialism. So there's kind of these three epochs. There are three eras that one is kind of existing in. And so what this has meant for Black folk is needing to make sense of what a schooling system has taught. Alongside that, to make sense of what your own have taught you. And so there's a distance, there's a movement that one kind of lives between, you know, between the classroom and the field, constantly working between those two, and never really kind of being secure or comfortable in either of these two places, the classroom and the field. And so a lot of my work is trying to make sense of that. I wouldn't call it a dichotomy, and I wouldn't call it a difference, but rather I would call them unique knowledge structures. And so the work that I often produce is working with facts. It's working with the kind of fictive dimension that extrapolates from the factual. And sometimes it's to do that. It's to start with something kind of fictive, and then from that work towards the fact, to a point where one of kind of the objective that I work towards is to produce work that is that really starts to question at what point is this fact and at what point is this fictive. And again, I think history exists in that form. So speaking of these two ends, these two places that forms a spectrum of my existence. To the left is an area called Greytown. It's a rural area. This is where my family's from. And so the field that I was talking about, this is the field, you know. The other side is Durban, which is a kind of urban context, urban suburban context, which is where I was raised, you know. And so kind of in a very physical and a very literal sense, I've been traveling between these places, but also epistemically as well. One has kind of been drawing from both locations, and often these two histories, these two locations are resistant. They are kind of in conflict with one another. There's a film of mine that is born out of an imagination of this rural area that I'm talking about, which is the Dark Cloud film that I put forward. And so what I'd in that film, there's a mention of this kind of what is called a cryptid snake. It's the snake that has never been seen, but it's been experienced, you know. And it's said to have occupied the mountain that's kind of that you see on the left hand side. It's this kind of towering mountain that sits not too far from the area that my family is from. And so what I kind of do, and I'd go to this place on holidays, for example, during school holidays. And there's one particular point I remember there was mention of the snake that had kind of been visiting this mountain. And so the snake, just to be clear, does not walk on land. It kind of flies, and it moves with the cloud. It moves. It occupies often deep lakes or water bodies, so to speak. And my grandmother was kind of one of the people who was the first to narrate and kind of lay or deposits like a rich narrative of folklore to me. And so when I started engaging with science fiction and speculative fiction, a lot of what I was coming across, or a lot of what I encountered, were the narratives that she had deposited in me. And so at this point, there was something very clear in the understanding that science fiction or techno-poetics is not something we inherited from the West. You know, it's something that has a very deep history in this location where I'm based. However, it's not framed as science fiction or speculative fiction. It operates in a completely different terrain, you know. And so this kind of this scripted snake that moves with the cloud, for example, was something I wanted to play with. On the one hand, I wanted to interrogate and kind of experiment with the imagination that produced the snake. The snake for me is not the points. It's what the snake allows us to think about. And so when one thinks about cloud culture, for example, and you think about the snake, there's a kind of connection that starts to emerge. Alongside of the snake has been this character in the film, the protagonist, who takes the form of this thing that we call, excuse me, that is called locally umuntu. It is said to consist of spirit matter and electric charge, electric form. Now, the question here is how, like, if we understand, if Africa has been written to be this backwards society, how is it that there is this figure that exists and consists of spirit form? Maybe I'll stop sharing here because I can always come back to it. How is it that there's this entity that exists in spirit form and electric charge? Surely there must be a particular understanding of materials, the composition and the performance of materials that's operational here. So my grandmother, for example, says she's encountered such a figure, right? It is said to be the state when one passes over, but you're not quite a ghost at this point. So it kind of exists between them. So this takes us to the concept or the notion or the figure of the cyborg or the post-human or the transhuman, so to speak, right? And so before one arrives at the cyborg, one has to contend with this figure that comes from one's backyard, so to speak, you know, and it's to move from this figure that is deeply located in one's folkloric tradition, and only then do you meet the cyborg. Often case we work from what the West has produced and we work backwards to what we have produced, you know. And I think there's a violence that happens at that point, because it means that you encounter one's own history through the lens and through the writing and the world making of the other, so to speak. And so I was interested in what happens when one starts in the one and goes to the other. And so in the film, you kind of engage with this character who had come from the fourth dimension and arrives at a location in the north of South Africa, which is called Mapungubwe. Mapungubwe is this kind of ancient ruin. So it exists as facts. It's a very significant archaeological site, and there are a lot of excavations that have been studied in Mapungubwe. One of the greatest objects that have come out of Mapungubwe is a gold smelted rhinoceros sculpture. It's said to be the oldest of its kind. Now the question is, if archaeologists and historians can confirm the fact that this artifact had come from this backward society, if we were able to produce this golden rhinoceros, what else, excuse me, what else have the people of Mapungubwe produced that has not surfaced, that was obliterated, that was erased, and that did not make it to the present? And it's this question for us that is quite fertile. We use as a fertile ground to start to stage other propositions that the people of Mapungubwe had created. Unfortunately, those objects and some of those practices did not make it to the present. And so in this film, one starts to make sense of these knowledge structures that I was talking about, this kind of cyborgian entity, which is a protagonist in the film, that is made of a spirit and electric charge. It's located in Mapungubwe, this kind of very fertile and rich sites of archaeological importance. And it's working with a particular kind of cloud culture and cloud phenomenon. All right. And so this it addresses the first section of my talk, which is thinking about the relationship between indigenous notions, indigeneity, and technology, and how the question of technology can be read from a different vantage point. So if we abandon the writing and the reading and the definitions of technology as it's been given by Silicon Valley, there's another place that one can talk about technology. But this requires us to expand the field of technology. And so maybe let me just, sorry, I want to go back to my slide and see if I'm not jumping ahead here. Yes, there it is. And so there's another figure that I want to add onto the figure of Umuntu, that's made of kind of the spiritual and electric charge, as well as this cryptid snake that I'd mentioned. And this figure is called Umkofu. And again, it's kind of it sits in what is popularly known as voodoo practice, right? Or black magic. But I think that's a way to kind of flatten. That's a Western way that aims to flatten a practice that the West cannot understand and decipher. You know, it requires us. So the way in which this figure is made utilizes a very ancient and sophisticated process of lobotomy, and it's to kind of capture and it's to kind of alter one's existence, one's consciousness and subconsciousness, so to speak. Now, again, one has to ask, how is it that these people have understood at a very fundamental and deep level the point at which the human is at its edge, is at its cusp, and you shift towards something else. It's basically an altered state, but it's kind of it's a perpetual altered states. Again, the entity itself is not the point. It is the possibility or the prospect that there's an understanding of lobotomy that has existed in this place before it was kind of granted by the West, you know? So one is constantly presenting these iterations at which indigenous peoples, and in the context of in my own context, it's South Africa, how these people have maintained a very long history of scientific thinking, an understanding of materiality, as well as a kind of quantum understanding, or at least understanding of the natural world at a quantum level. And if we were to pour enough resources to assemble archaeologists, yeah, transcendentalists, scientists, people from biochemistry, if you were to kind of combine and kind of undertake and engage in a sustained study in trying to accumulate and bring together this deep well of knowledge, what might we come up with? Right. The colonial project is a few hundreds, if not thousand years in the making. We've only just started, right? However, somehow there's a hijacking of our imagination that kind of foregrounds Western scientific thinking as the authority. And the reason I'd spoken about the need for Afrofuturism to kind of spread its attention is to say, I'm speaking from my own locality. What happens when we are in conversation with people in India? What happens when we're in conversation with people, say, in New Zealand, and so on and so forth? And suddenly there's a really kind of, there's a very pregnant kind of knowledge that one would be working with, and it starts to texture. I mean, the crisis that we faced today is primarily because of the West, as some might argue or perhaps agree. And as we reach this crisis point, we are looking for alternatives. We are looking for other ways to relate to living entities, right, and other than living entities. For me, in my view, they are these other references that one can draw on and kind of point to how the relationship between humans and other entities has been orchestrated and structured. So I go back to my so I'm going to share this because I think it's a really important point for you to see, which I will read out as well. I have a particular interest in language. There it is. I have a particular interest in language, and I will read out here what two scholars say. And this has been something that I've used as a kind of cardinal. So the first is by an academic who's based in India, who says, choosing to expand a vocabulary then can be an argument for the need for new words. So it's kind of arguing for the creation of new words. Or, he continues, new meanings of older words, precisely to enable an expansion of the life forms under consideration. And the terms that I'd been referring to lead us, or at least the terms that I've been utilizing, say something about, I'm not getting this right. The terms that I put forward, these folkloric figures that I'd mentioned, for me, it would be interesting, and I often go to the etymology of the term. So it's not the term itself, it's where the term comes from. How did the syllables come together? And what does the underlying meaning behind the term tell me, right? So one term that I could utilize here is an isiZulu word, which is isiZulu is my mother tongue, which is for electricity or lights. It's called ugesi. Now, in the way that the language has evolved over time, and I have to actually move on here, I'm going quite slow. The way in which the language has evolved is for objects, for inventions that have not come from isiZulu speakers, you often put an I and you'd kind of appropriate the English term for that. And so when a term like electricity, which is thanks to, say, the Edison and so on, if clearly this term is a very old term, so it tells us that there was a way in which power or electricity was operational here. Perhaps it's not in the form of light bulbs, for example. And so what was that form? And where does the term come from? And at what points did it enter the language, right? Because this helps us to locate and kind of tell a trajectory of technological and scientific thinking from this continent. The other, speaking on language, the other writer is a Kenyan writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he says, "We African writers are bound by our calling to do for our languages what Spencer, Milton, and Shakespeare did for English, what Pushkin and Tolstoy did for Russia. Indeed, what all writers in the world history have done for their languages by meeting the challenge of creating a literature in them, which process later opens the language for philosophy, for science, technology, and all other areas of human creative endeavors." And so this kind of mandates this challenge that these two writers place on us, place perhaps on language, is a really important one. And this is why I was talking about the interest in the etymology as well as the imagination that produces the terms. Earlier on, I'd mentioned, I'd spoken about the scripted snake that's featured in the film as well. And these two images are of Howick Falls. Excuse me. So this area is not too far from where I'm located at the moment. It's maybe 2 hours at max. This cryptid snake had been spotted here. It is an event that has been recorded, right? So again, the kind of the superiority of writing. So it was cited twice at this waterfall. It's said to exist at the bottom of it. So I just thought it might be useful to kind of bring to you. And if you Google this, you might find a bunch of speculations around the snake. So now I kind of abandon this question of indigeneity and technology, and I start to talk about techno-politics, so which is the political dimension of technology as it exists here. We choose, when I say we, I'm talking about Francois, Amy, and myself. We've kind of arrived at this point of the 1960s in the context of Africa. Between late 50s and the early 60s was a time that the first countries had gained independence. At the same time, we kind of had this kind of Cold War as a backdrop. Okay, the Soviet Union having supported a few of the independence movements on the continent, and so there was a loyalty and there was a kind of commitment to this other world that was not the imperialist powers that had colonized most of the continents. And at the time of independence, there was the non-aligned movements, which were a number of states that had decided to not take sides, so to speak. And so the idea was that there was not a political agenda that would be outright communist or social, or maybe communist more specifically. Neither is it this kind of overly capitalistic drive that had engulfed the continent for the preceding centuries. And there was a need to carve out a place for us to define where and we placed ourselves on the political spectrum. Alongside this wave of the non-alignment movements, on the continent were a series of projects, these mega scale projects that looked to kind of to thrust the African continent into the world of industrialization. And I guess it's in some way it was a way to kind of flex a kind of a power, you know. And there are a few of these that we kind of this is the starting point for most of the work that we've done. So the second film that I'd shared was the Imprint archive by Francois and Amy, who are my collaborators as well. And that project was kind of looking at mining operations that fuel the technological drive across the markets, so to speak. And so I'll put I'll bring up the screen again, and I'll kind of talk to them briefly. And Aliyah, if you can, please just kind of signal as the time goes, right? Like kind of sometimes I get really carried away to call myself. So when you like, yeah, 15 minutes or 10 minutes to the point, please let me know. So I don't want to make any assumptions. So I'm sorry if I'm kind of repeating information that is obvious to you. And so, as I mentioned, kind of like the point at which we pick up on this topic of technopolitics is around the 1960s. There are a few projects that I kind of want to highlight as a way to kind of place in front of you some of the contentions that animated that period. And so the one was the Pan-African Atom Bomb Project. This was on the back of kind of countries in West Africa feeling that they've separated from from its previous colonial powers, and the threats that these nations might still, I'll use the term, attack, you know, and there was a need for the continent to have a plan, you know, kind of considering that it was also a kind of Cold War as a backdrop. And so this project had called together a few countries in West Africa primarily to come together and think about how to construct a kind of a nuclear bomb. And alongside the spirit of the non-alignment movement was the decision to scrap the bomb on ethical reasons. You know, it was the idea that the world is kind of there was the nuclear disarmament that sort of had gained quite a bit of momentum on the continent, so much so that the neglect, the abandonment of the Pan-African atom bomb was followed by a very strong resistance against French test sites in the Algerian Sahara. So in a space of 6 years, I think it was between 1960 and 1966, France had carried a total of 17 tests. It is said in kind of in articles that the ramifications of those tests still exists today. And so there were I remember reading a paper that was published by an academic who was kind of he had narrated the story of this group, a very select group of African leaders, civic leaders as well as political leaders and environmentalists, who had come together to protest against this French test sites in Algeria, and they had driven from West Africa all the way to Algeria to stage a contest against this. It's a really, really beautiful narration of this journey of these people who had moved from West Africa to North Africa by vehicle. To test this. So there's a particular kind of consciousness that I think starts to emerge around this period. And again, I think it arrives onto the document that I was talking about earlier on, which is around indigeneity and notions of technology. So in a way, there's a different ethical response and ethical positions that the African continents, leaders of the African states had taken around technology and the kind of the destructive potentials of technology. The next three projects are slightly different in nature, which is a car that was manufactured in Kenya around about that same time. It was the Nyayo car, and the imperative was to build a car that was completely manufactured in Kenya. Again, it's kind of thinking of how do we define ourselves as a country or as a continent, and so kind of our relationship to natural resources and intellectual property becomes quite important. And so the Nyanyo car is one such case. It had taken its inspiration from the I think it was a proton car that was manufactured in Singapore, you know. And then alongside that was the Akosombo Dam, which was a hydroelectric dam that was built in the Volta region in Ghana. These projects were not successful in the way that they were imagined. Okay, but again, the point is not the projects themselves, but it is what what these projects tell us about our relationship with technology. They were kind of overly ambitious some might say they were overly ambitious, and this is part of the failure. I mean, the Volta Dam, for example, it kind of it broke the walls and kind of created a lake as a result, but it's still operational today, right? And these projects, I think, when I say they were slightly different, they were not so much talking about the ethical imperative and consideration that I mentioned earlier, but rather it was thinking about how do Africans utilize the materials of innovation, the materials of technology to form a sense of self-dependence, you know, as opposed to being dictated by the West at the time. So this obviously gets disrupted in the 70s and the 80s with all kinds of neo-colonial acts that the previous colonial powers had kind of interfered with on the continent. And this leads me to think about what this means for techno-politics today. So the most popular is the mining operations around the Tanganyika region, the copper belts, and the mining of uranium in parts of the DRC. And these are the kind of the most popular. And I think the article that I'd shared, which is No Congo, No Technologies, makes that point really, really well. This idea that the places that fuel and support the markets of technology are the ones that are the furthest from owning those technologies and those artifacts. And what we have today is a different kind of technological problem, which what I'd said is the plague of smart cities, right? And so there's a way in which the smart city implicates a lot of, I think it complicates the relationship between African states. So I often make the case that the infrastructure of technology that exists on the continent today was an infrastructure that was laid by the colonial powers during settler colonialism. And so there's a kind of there's a continuous line, there's a continuous story of the infrastructures of technology. So most of the infrastructures of technology are not owned by African countries, right? They're owned by mega corporations. Just a slightly different orientation to a previous regime, which was nation states, right? And what we have, so the kind of the way that I can maybe highlight and make clear this problem that I'm trying to talk about, Cape Town has one of the biggest, in fact, it is the biggest and most important kind of I can't remember what the technical term is, but it's basically the place where these mega corporations keep their servers, right, to serve the entire continent of Africa, right? It is it's located in a very prime position. It's the furthest place from the closest one. So there's a kind of there's a scientific logic to why it exists in Cape Town. There's also the kind of the political and economic structure that allows such a significant investment of Google, for example, and Amazon to be located there, right? But South Africa also has a huge migrant community. So these are workers from the DRC, from Malawi, from Zimbabwe, and Mozambique who come to South Africa looking for economic opportunities. These people then meet the other side, the other side of technology, which is what we call platform urbanization. So these are cities that are primarily driven by, say, Uber Eats, by Uber as a kind of, passenger form. It is the notion of smart cities, perhaps, and the Internet of Things. So it's the idea that these people who leave their homes, their home countries, mostly displaced by extractive economies, they come to South Africa and meet this idea of a smart city. They are often in the service. They often work in that sector, again, in the context of South Africa, either as drivers for Ubers or drivers for kind of food delivery services. So there's a different face. There's the other face of technology that they engage with. And what South Africa gets implicated in here, what South Africa gets implicated in here is starting to be the outlets, the vehicle, and the bridge that connects these northern investments on the continent. And so the ethical position that I spoke about around the 1960s is completely negated, and it's turned on its head. And what you have is an African state that starts to perpetuate the exploits of technology over humans. Okay. And I think it's a really important point to raise, because it places a certain kind of responsibility on us as practitioners, as policymakers, and those interested in the complexities and the entanglements of technology, right? So in a way, South Africa becomes a shadow of Silicon Valley through this. Now, South Africa as well is one of the biggest proponents of the smart city, from policymakers to governments. There are other countries on the continent, but there's a kind of economic structure that makes a smart city somewhat feasible. It may be significantly flawed, but certainly it's in that grip. A lot of the notions of smart cities are not coming from the continent. They come from Europe, and they come from the United States, and it's all has to do with the explosion of platforms, for consumptions. And so the points I'm trying to illustrate here is that there are these three chapters. I kind of started utilizing the film as a way to think about indigeneity and technology. It kind of moved to the second chapter, which was looking at these mega scale projects on the continents that were established. There was a kind of ethical foresights that some of these leaders had. And the point that we are at here, through the veil of the smart city, there's a bunch of really sophisticated political, geopolitical, as well as capitalist intentions that get deployed in the mask of cities, under place of cities. And I don't think we have done enough work in trying to interrogate, where does the language of smart cities come from? Where does the imagination come from? And whose templates are we utilizing to talk about smarts? Smart in itself is a kind of it's a loaded term, because it means that there's a universal logic of what is smart, who is smart, and what does smart look like. It has a very particular picture, right? And so you see there's an evolving choreograph that these technologies are utilizing, and it's really advanced. And so the question is, and I was talking about initially, I was talking about how do I utilize our projects as a way to situate our own practice and our own thinking, and to ask you, what does this say about your context in Kazakhstan? And how do we start to kind of talk across territories, talk across borders, as a way of building a counter narrative and a counter intelligence to the dominant narrative of smart cities, of technology? If you do a foray, if you kind of do a quick scan of the terms that define technology, they mostly come from North Europe. Sorry, they mostly come from Europe and North America, right? So if you look at the terms of, I don't know, like the Trojan horse perhaps is the closest example that I can find. This is speaking to a kind of Greek imagination, no? And others, there are many others. And so there's a way in which even the terms that we inherit, that we are given to talk about technology, are not our own. And I feel that unless we can own the language through which we talk about this, we will constantly be working in the back foot. It also means that the users of the technology are quite distant. They're separated from the core imagination, the kind of like, if one is to think of the imagination as a structure, we are quite distant from the structure that makes technology. And so a lot of what we're advocating is to kind of explode out and create multiple languages for us to talk about language, you know. And this was my interest in language, and the two academics that I quoted, and the challenge that they put to creators, and how they should be thinking about language, and what the mandate is from them. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Dzata. How am I looking on time, Alea?
Yeah, it's fine. We have 10 more minutes or 15. You can stop, to be honest. Yeah. So you take your time.
All right, okay. I'll now look at Dzata. So I will switch to another presentation that I want to share. So this is the first project that Francois, Amy, and myself have collaborated on. We've kind of been fans of each other's work, and this was a moment for us to come together and play. Bear with me. All right, this is much better. Okay. Almost there. Okay. It's quite expensive, this work, so I'm just kind of trying to figure out a starting point. We had tried to coalesce, we had tried to collapse these three chapters that I'd spoken about. So partly it was picking up on the work that Amy and Francois had done around the kind of the mining activities and the hauntings of the archives of technology on the continent, and I kind of met them with my interest in indigeneity and those versions of technology and scientific thinking. We then spread our hands and looked at other thinkers that were doing the writing of technology and technological and scientific and innovative thinking on the continent. And there are a few who emerged. So the one who was also the mentor to our project is Professor Clapperton Mavunga, who's based at MIT, is from Zimbabwe. And he had started to look at what he had called everyday technology. So these were practices, behaviors, and objects that were created in the everyday that we often dismiss, you know. But the point was, it's these everyday kind of technologies that lead us to the grand narratives, to the grand technologies or grand inventions. So when I mentioned earlier on, I mean, there's something he says, he says it's a joke until it's an invention or something like this. And I think partly what the point he's making here is to constantly probe, to propose audacious ideas or claims, and if you do this for long enough, something gets born from that imagination. There's a momentum that is built as a result of that. And the speculative method operates in more or less the same way. It's the idea that you kind of put something forward. And so, as I said about the case of Mapungubwe, if this gold-smelted rhinoceros was discovered in Mapungubwe, what else did the people of Mapungubwe do? Could they have done this? Could they have done that? Could they have done that? Right? And some people may dismiss this and say it's scientifically inaccurate, it's historically flawed, or so on. But I think out of that process of making claims, of taking stakes and proposing, there's something that starts to happen. And so this project had drawn from this slate of audacious and in some cases failed projects of the 1960s, and working from the spirit of the Pan-African, which is questionable at times, we had created this institute that was looking at technology at the level of consciousness. And this level of consciousness is speaking both about a spiritual consciousness, but it's also speaking about a very practical awareness, to be awake to something. And what is this thing we're being awake to? Is the deployment, it's the utility of technology for Africans in Africa. So how do we appropriate the tools that we're given to discharge them, to reach the ends that prioritize our imagination of the future? So this is the way that we were thinking about consciousness, right? And we had drawn from another kind of in talking about the people who inspired the work. There was a kind of a piece of research we came across, which was looking at one of the revolutionaries from Cape Verde. It's Amilcar Cabral, Guinea-Bissau, and he was talking about, there was a notion that he had proposed. He was a kind of agriculturalist by training, and in Portugal he had kind of gotten the revolutionary spirits, and he had kind of was one of the main protagonists of the anti-imperialist movements in Cape Verde. And what he had utilized as a spirit is this idea of soil studies. And it was partly looking at how his own training as someone who had come from a kind of agricultural field, how that could be fused with revolutionary thinking. And the underlying principle here was that the liberation movements concerns not only the liberation of humans, but it's also to liberate nature from the shackles of imperialism. And so it kind of starts to explode out this very kind of confined definition and scope of technology as it's been handed to us. And what we're doing here is to constantly stretch it, to constantly open it up and start making connections where they are not apparent, perhaps. And so we kind of bring this into our project. There was another paper we came across that was looking at healing practices from Southern Africa. They were looking at spiritual healing practices as it connects to wind and mountain ranges, wind drafts and mountain ranges. And so again, there was this spectrum of like the understanding of natural elements and wind phenomena, and how that affects a spiritual awakening or a spiritual presence on an individual. And so we had kind of stretched this. So, okay, there's a factual basis. We can stretch this and start thinking about a language system which utilizes a whistling method that is often utilized or used by spiritualists from the continent. And so there's something around wind technologies and resonance that was starting to emerge, as well as this kind of language system that utilizes whistling and it's connected to wind, of course, and mountain ranges and spiritual kind of consciousness. So, you know, there's a way in which we are working from a very factual basis, and then we stretch out the extent and the meanings. And then we started to work with AI visual generators. And the idea was that if the documents, if the images, and if the visions of technology do not hold the imagination of Africans, how do we then utilize a machine to bridge that gap? And so we started kind of putting in a number of prompts to generate ideas. And what we thought of doing with the images that came out of that was to think of these objects as age-old, ancient projects that were started and never finished, in the same way that the projects of the 1960s, for example, that were started and some had failed. And so the idea was that there is a centuries-long history of the Institute of Technological Consciousness that we're assembling and bringing together here. So working from a basis and kind of moving out. So here we were thinking about language, for example, writing systems, and how we can think of that, and kind of, you know, going back to the note to hieroglyphics, and coming back to the present. I'm just going to kind of scroll through this for you to get a sense of. So here we're thinking about the first long-range communication device, which was the drum. That was used by folks as they moved from present-day Zimbabwe into Southern Africa. So, you know, again, kind of thinking long-range communication devices. Before the cell phone, there was a drum that was utilized. Let's see. So here we are talking about the technology in its African past, which is what I've just related to you right now. So the idea that what is called black magic or witchcraft is a way to dismantle and to flatten a very deep and sophisticated practice that kind of demands a very evolved knowledge of materials and how you conjure materials together to have an effect at the level of consciousness and to alter nature as we know it. You know, so I'm towards the end now, so I'm just kind of going to scroll through, and then we can open up to some questions. Here we're kind of looking at river systems as well as ruins across the continent. So we had cast the ruins across the continent as sites of technological peaks. These are moments when somewhere in the continent, for some reason or the other, there were a bunch of inventions that were made, and us standing or sitting from the present can't make sense of them. Right. And so what happens when one starts to aggregate and pull together the rich outputs that came out of these places, you know, and was to think about the consciousness of water as well, you know. This was understood as one of the various chapters of the Institute. Was dated 1553, from the year 1553. These are all kind of very speculative methods. Of course, here what we're looking at is this idea that in order for us to write and to read and understand and speak about technology requires us to break the silos, you know, that currently are placed in defining technology. And so there's a much more expansive field that one has to go into when you have to think about the role and how technology is deployed beyond the gadgets, hardware, and software. So these are some of the costumes that we had made for the protagonists. You would have seen this in the films as well. yeah, so this is really the end of the document. So I'll stop sharing here. Yeah. It was really tricky to bring all of this together because it's and on the one hand I have to make sure that I'm not like very like localized in what I'm saying, at the same time to also not be too didactic in what I say. But it's hard to kind of have a very linear narrative to this work. But I was kind of utilizing the 3 projects that I'd shared for you to get a sense of how we're thinking about our own histories and thinking about the speculative method as a way to give them air and to build room for them to exist alongside other histories, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Russell, for your beautiful talk and the research that you're doing with Amy and Francois. Also, they joined us already. Thank you so much. And it's really for this so many thoughts and questions. And it's interesting how it really, how the research that you're doing and the projects resonate in our locality, in our context. And there are so many different parallels that we can see and find and sense. Yeah, thank you for that. So now we're moving to the discussion point, which will be closed, and we're finishing the broadcast. Игорь, мы закрываем.